Good afternoon, or selamat pagi if you're in Indonesia. Welcome to you all. My name is Tim Lindsay and I am Director of the Centre for Indonesian Law, Islam and Society at the University of Melbourne. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we stand. In the case of the University of Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Thank you again for joining us today, and special thanks to the speakers from Indonesia and Australia who have so generously given us their time despite the very challenging conditions and constraints created by the pandemic. At a time when universities and the people who work in them are facing pressures they would never have imagined a year ago, including from our own university leaders, your support for events like this is particularly appreciated. Today's conference is hosted by SILIS and by IDeHaRI, which stands for the Indonesian Democracy Hallmark Research Initiative. IDeHaRI is a 3-year interdisciplinary research project that is funded by the university. It has been created to develop deeper understandings of the challenges to the quality of democracy in Indonesia by supporting scholars working on Indonesia at this university with research grants, support for the Indonesia at Melbourne blog, which I hope all of you read, and events like this one. I'm the chair of IDeHaRI, Dr. Dave McRae is deputy chair, and Dr. Helen Pausaka is the academic convener. The theme of today's event is assessing Indonesia's response to COVID-19. We will explore it with 4 panels of distinguished speakers over 2 days. Today's 2 panels will cover issues related to politics and rights, and tomorrow they will look at health and society. So please do stay with us today and come back again tomorrow. Each day we will run from 2 to about 4 p.m. Melbourne time, with 3 speakers presenting in each panel and time for questions. A detailed conference program is available in fact on the conference website, and I'll just ask our team to put the link to the website up in the chat. There it is. Thank you very much. If you haven't got the program, just click there and you'll be able to access it. During the presentations today and tomorrow, only the speakers and chairs will be visible on the screen. Attendees will not be visible, but you will be able to ask questions in writing through the Zoom Q&A function. Just type them in during the session and they will be answered live by the speakers at the end of the session. We'll have 3 speakers and then a time for questions. Please note that this workshop will be recorded and it may be published online at a later stage, and there may be attendees from the media taking part in the conference. This event is managed and moderated behind the scenes by Catherine Taylor and Debbie Yu, who are the manager and administrator of SILIS. And I know we already have a lot to thank them. We'll have even more to thank them for by the time we finish tomorrow. Speakers and chairs, if you have any problems during the seminar, please email Catherine and Debbie. Now, let's go straight to our first session. I will now hand over to the IDeHaRI Deputy Chair, Dr. Dave McRae of the University's Asia Institute, to introduce the members of the first panel. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Tim, and greetings everyone, and welcome to our online conference today, where we'll focus on politics and rights for the whole of today's 2 sessions. And those, of course, are topics that have never been far from the headlines in Indonesia since the COVID-19 pandemic started, but perhaps all the more so today with the passage of the highly contentious Omnibus law on job creation yesterday. Now, the format we'll use today is we'll have 3 speakers in our first panel. All 3 of the speakers really need no introduction at all, so I'll be very brief in inviting them to make their presentation. We've asked each of them to undertake the very difficult task of distilling their presentation down to just 10 minutes to allow time for discussion at the end. And while they're speaking, all attendees are of course welcome to submit questions via the Q&A function, which will then come to after the 3 of our speakers have made their presentations. And so without further ado, the first of our speakers is Associate Professor Marcus Mietzner. And while I'm describing his biographical details, Marcus, if you are using a PowerPoint at all, please feel welcome to set up your screen sharing now. Marcus is an associate professor in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Coral Bell School of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. And he's speaking today on COVID-19 and democratic regression in Indonesia, its causes and effects. So we're delighted that Marcus is able to join us, and over to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Tim. So I was asked to talk about democratic regression in Indonesia within the framework of the pandemic, and it's important to distinguish two major policy fields here, and that is first how democratic regression in Indonesia has actually shaped a COVID-19 response in Indonesia, and then a second separate arena, how the pandemic in itself has led to further democratic deficits. So I'll talk about very briefly about these two arenas. So the first one, how democratic decline in Indonesia, which most of us in the field of political science on Indonesia now believe has taken place since at least the early 2010s. How has this democratic decline shaped the pandemic response in Indonesia? There's various ways one can approach that. Aurel Kosong, for instance, has termed the kinds of democracies that were most vulnerable to a poor pandemic response as democracies with pre-existing conditions, meaning democracies that were already weak at the time that the pandemic hit, and where these weaknesses and deficits then led to a particularly poor response. I have already written about this in a publication for the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs, where I identified a number of democratic weaknesses in Indonesia that contributed to a deficient pandemic response. But if I have to pick out one to highlight here, that would be the rise of populism in Indonesia since about 2014, which led to a specific pandemic response. Now, in terms of the definition of populism that I'm using here, it's the one by Cas Mudde, which a lot of populism researchers are applying to their studies of populist leaders. That definition focuses mostly on the tendency of populists towards simplistic categorizations of society and solutions to political problems. Now, the simplistic separation, for instance, between the people and the elite, simplistic solutions applied to the crisis of democracies and so forth, all of that then can be seen in specific populist approaches to governance. In terms of the pandemic, we have seen, not surprisingly then, around the globe, a particular pandemic response by populist leaders. And there were, if we have to boil it down to a number of features that were common to populist responses to pandemics, there were about 7 of them. And Indonesia, again, having experienced populism since 2014 in particular, not only within the elite, but also within its population. I've done research with Diego Fossati through opinion surveys about populist attitudes in Indonesia. And the result was that those populist attitudes are significantly stronger in Indonesia than in other comparable countries. So we have Indonesia, like other countries, experiencing vulnerability to populism for the last 5 years, 6 years or so. Now, then it wasn't surprising, indeed, that Indonesia shared a number of these populist features in pandemic response. The first one being the ignoring and downplaying of the threat at the very early phase of the crisis. Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, Obrador in Mexico, many did the same thing, trying to convince the population that in fact the threat wasn't all that large, and Jokowi clearly did the same thing. In fact, we have in Indonesia seen a number of approaches to explain why that was the case. That ranged from the tropical weather in Indonesia to a specific Malay ethnic feature that proved immune to the virus, to in fact the fact that Indonesia is such a devout Muslim country. So that was the first phase of populist responses, and Indonesia was fully in line with that. The second was the populist description of the crisis as an unwelcome interruption to economic development projects. Again, Trump, we have seen how that was being packaged. He put out to the electorate that he was on the way to building the biggest economy in the history of the world and so forth. And the pandemic came to interrupt exactly that. Now, Jokowi, very similarly, on the way to push through his Omnibus bill project, which was packaged as the economic platform for the second term, the building of the new capital and so forth, and suddenly the pandemic came to interrupt all of that. The third feature that is common in populist responses to the pandemic is the spinning of the numbers, which we have seen in the United States as well as in Brazil and other countries as well, and certainly Indonesia has done the same thing. We have seen that just 2 days ago, in fact, when the president claimed that Indonesia was actually doing very well, largely based on the number of recoveries rather than on the number of infections or fatalities. The fourth feature then was the very reluctant agreement of populists to some limited social distancing regulations and lockdowns in March and April. Trump agreed to that. Jokowi agreed to that as well. The fifth feature, and again, very common across all populist polities, the promotion of very anti-scientific solutions to the problem, and the symbol of that became hydroxychloroquine, which all of the populists promoted. Jokowi did so as well, like Trump, like Bolsonaro and other populist leaders as well. The sixth feature then was the push to reopen the economy very early from May, which in Indonesia, Jokowi did under the packaging of the return to normal, which many medical experts viewed as premature. And then finally, seventh, again, Trump being the leader of this, but Jokowi also doing the same thing, this investment of almost all policy and financial resources into the development of a vaccine and the putting of pressure on authorities to circumvent official trial procedures. We know that Jokowi has demanded very early on that the vaccine be promoted and be ready within 3 months, to which a lot of his experts said we actually can't do that. So this final solution, if you will, that populists think the vaccine will be to the vaccine, common to all populist polities, and Indonesia has followed suit in that regard. So my argument here would be that the most damaging democratic deficit that Indonesia suffered from prior to the pandemic, and that hit it most ferociously prior to the pandemic, was vulnerability to populist ideals of simplistic solutions to very complex problems, because that's essentially what populism is doing. It rebels against the complexity of society and offers very simple approaches to what, in the case of the pandemic, is an incredibly complex issue. Just very briefly on some of the democratic deficits that were compounded by the pandemic, and many of the sort of political observers looking at this issue have pointed to the militarization of the response. Sana Jeffrey and others have written about this, Jun Honna as well, very good pieces indeed. Just a number of comments on that. For me, the problem of the involvement of the military in the pandemic response is actually not the fact that the military is involved. I think there is a legitimate role for militaries in pandemic responses. We've seen it in Vietnam, we've seen it in China, and in fact, we have seen it in Australia as well, where the fact that the military wasn't involved in quarantining overseas returnees in Melbourne was identified as one of the problems in the triggering of the second wave. So clearly, in many societies where the pandemic was handled effectively, the military was part of it. The problem in Indonesia is that the military was actually not used for what it was best suited for, and that was overseeing of lockdowns, control of social distancing measures, and so forth, when it was most needed in March and April. The military wasn't involved at the time. Jokowi only rolled it out in late May, and that was not to oversee a lockdown, but in fact the opposite, and that was the reopening of the economy to secure the new normal. The regulations that the military was asked to oversee were in fact very lax and remain so. And we've seen surveys that one of the major reasons why Indonesian citizens are reluctant to follow health protocol is that the sanctions are either not there or they are very low.
Just a 2-minute warning, Marcus.
Yes, so we have this one problem that the military in fact wasn't used for what it is best positioned. It was then used for things that its individual leaders had very little expertise in. And that's where we come to the issue of military officers being involved in the management of the campaign. We have Tarawan, the Minister of Health, who, when he was appointed in October 2019, already faced significant opposition from the Indonesian Doctors Association for his lack of real expertise and his controversial treatments. Then we have Doni Monardo, who was a military officer prior to becoming the head of the disaster relief agency, but had no expertise whatsoever in managing pandemics. It's different to manage an earthquake and a pandemic. He simply lacks that capacity. And then, of course, the involvement of the Army Chief of Staff, Andika Perkasa, in the newly reformed COVID task force in July. And the first thing he did was, in that capacity, was pushing a very controversial cocktail mix that he, with the University of Surabaya, tried to develop, and in which he took the unusual step of actually visiting the Indonesian approval institution for such medicines to essentially push for a quick approval. So again, I think the problem of the militarization is not so much that the military is involved in the pandemic at all. It was involved in the wrong areas, and it was involved in the wrong projects, if you like, in projects that would have required other expertise than military experience. Just finally, I think one area we need to be concerned about in that context of militarization is the very rapidly growing role of BIN in the pandemic control, which is, as far as I can see, entirely unregulated. So BIN has been going out, doing testing and so forth, which of course, based on its mission, its role for what it is there for, is not prescribed at all. So just concluding here, we have two complexes. I think there were damages in the Indonesian polity and democratic deficits that were visible to everyone prior to the pandemic, and that led to a particular response. Again, there were a number of these deficits. I picked out one, which I think was the most damaging, and that was the Indonesian tendency in the last 6 years or so towards populist responses. And then secondly, we had a controversial militarization in which I have a slightly different approach than other critics, where I focus more on the wrong use of the military rather than the use of the military at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for a very strong start to proceedings. Just in the interim, I'd invite Mughis if you'd like to start putting your slides up. But I'd have to say, with all the parallels you've drawn between Indonesia's response and the other populists, we might have to ask you in the Q&A how you expect Jokowi might react if he were to contract COVID-19, as we've seen Trump do over the last few days. Our next speaker, as I've flagged, is Dr. Abdil Mudafir, a thesis prize-winning alumnus of the Asia Institute here at the University of Melbourne, who's currently also a postdoctoral research visitor at the Asia Institute. His home affiliation, if you like, is as a lecturer in the Department of Sociology in the State University of Jakarta. Today, he'll be speaking on exploiting the COVID-19 crisis, deepening illiberalism in Indonesia. So over to you, Mughis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to IDeHaRI and Silis for inviting me to give a talk in this conference. Today, I'm going to talk about the way Indonesian government respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in relations to the nature of the political economic system. This presentation is developed from my co-author article with Rafika Kurotayun, so I should acknowledge her in this presentation as well. The question that I'm going to address in this talk is maybe a bit similar to what has been discussed by Mughis. Why have certain countries been relatively more successful than others? This is despite the different political regime, either authoritarian or democracy. The success and failure should not only be defined in terms of how the spread of the virus can be controlled, but also in relation to how citizens' rights can be protected. So when we cross-step different features of political regime with how we define the success and failure of controlling the outbreak, we will get this table. Some authoritarian countries like China, Vietnam, and Singapore have been successful in containing the virus, but by violating citizens' rights, as seen from how state surveillance has been deepened and extended in these countries. But other authoritarian countries, like in Iran, fail at controlling the pandemic and, of course, in protecting citizens' rights as well. Some democracies, like in South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, have been successful both at containing the virus and protecting rights. But in Sweden, for example, the number of cases in this country was really high compared to other Scandinavian countries or in broader European countries. Its mortality rate is also high, which was claimed as a result of the attempts to protect the rights of the citizen by not undertaking lockdown measures, but by enforcing like voluntary compliance or individual responsibilities. In other democratic countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, India, Brazil, Hungary, the US, the government has failed at both containing the pandemic and also protecting rights. So there are many factors actually to explain this, but Indonesian experience underlines how illiberal nature of politics. I define this by where the rule of law is relatively absent, government accountability is low, and rent-seeking is pervasive, has made public health crisis is being exploited for illiberal purposes, leading to poor handling of the pandemic. This is to say that the failure in dealing with the pandemic and violation against rights in Indonesia is not simply because the government has no capacity or that because Jokowi has no leaderships. Indeed, Indonesia has a problem with public health capacity, like inadequate ratio of bed and patient, doctor and patient, insufficiency of medical instrument like ventilators and testing and tracing tools. That other countries that have a better public health capacity and medical instruments, like those in European countries and the US, also fail at containing the outbreak. So. And some argue also that populist leaders have made the pandemic worse, but some countries in Europe that are not led by right-wing populists also fail at containing the virus. There is also an argument that the success of controlling the outbreak depends more on voluntary compliance than on government enforcement. Level of trust in government is one of the instruments used to measure voluntary compliance. It is stated that trust enables some countries to convince their citizens to allow mass testing and quarantine. According to this argument, China, Singapore, South Korea have been successful in containing the outbreak, made possible by the high level of trust in government in these countries. Meanwhile, the declining trust in most of European countries, including in the US, since the 2008 financial crisis contribute in the poor handling of the outbreak in these countries. But if we see this figure, such an argument is unfounded. Indonesia ranked third most trusted government in 2020, but many reports have shown that Indonesia's handling of the pandemic is the worst in Southeast Asia. More importantly, as the government is less transparent in reporting the case, it is very likely that the real number of cases is higher than that of officially reported. In fact, like mortality rate also in Indonesia also the 10th worst in the world. And yeah, we can see this figure. So why is this the case? I argue that it has to do with how the government and the broader predatory network see the pandemic. Some countries have failed in controlling the outbreak and protecting rights because they have not seen the crisis as a problem, then as an opportunity to maximize the accumulation of power and tangible resources. Orban in Hungary, for example, uses the pandemic to seize unlimited power. Many governments around the world, like in the Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, in India, in Turkey, use the pandemic to silence the opposition and to limit political demonstrations. Indonesia also follows the same path, exploiting the pandemic for illiberal purposes made possible by the illiberal nature of political economic system. Some evidence can be presented here, among others, that we can see the fact that the government has no interest. So this is the key point, is that the government has no interest in undertaking massive and free testing and contact tracing of the COVID-19. The government also has little interest in providing sufficient financial support to the lower class, the most affected and vulnerable section of society due to the outbreak. More than 3.5 million workers have been laid off and forced to take unpaid leave. A month after the first case in Indonesia, the government announced to apply large-scale social restriction of PSBB instead of territorial quarantine or lockdown, a measure that requires the government to deliver social security payment. The government claimed that the spending on the poor due to the pandemic has been increased, but the spending has been planned before the pandemic, confirming that the claim is actually misleading as meant to boost Jokowi's own popularity after many critics directed to Indonesia's health minister, Tarawan. Although the half of the money has been used, there is also a problem in distribution of the aid. Many of them have not received the money, the poor, so that they have to keep working to survive, making them unable to practice social distancing. And then there is also the case of presidential staff members that have exploited the pandemic to enrich their own companies, like in the case of Ruang Guru and Amarta Micro Fintech. The parliament also, where majority of the members are government supporter, also has done the deliberation of many controversial bills rejected during the 2019 student demonstration. Indonesian mining law, for instance, was passed in May during the pandemic. Last week, the parliament has just completed deliberation of Omnibus bill, and yesterday, the bill was just passed. This bill reduces many labor rights and weaken businesses' responsibilities for environmental protections. So, and the police has also released a letter banning any possible labor protest responding to this to the bill, after giving misinformation about the date for the plenary session to avoid or disorganize possible labor protests. Meanwhile, amid the pandemic, the government continued holding 2020 simultaneous local election, although there are restrictions on offline campaigns. Some candidates, including Gibran and Bobby, Jokowi's family have broken the rules without receiving any sanctions. There is also a militarization of Indonesia's COVID-19 management, as have been discussed by Mughis before. And the government has also spent a lot of money for the influencer instead of allocating them for the poor or to support public health facilities. As a result, the spreading of the virus is getting worse day by day. And again, instead of taking the pandemic more seriously, the government blames the citizens, especially the lower class, for the problems resulted from the poor handling of the pandemic. The poor has been blamed for the ignorant in practicing social distancing. Other section of the poor, especially those engaged in Preman organizations, are also mobilized to enforce COVID-19 protocol, clashing the poor with each other. So to conclude, the failure of Indonesia's government in containing the outbreak and protecting rights is a result of its illiberal nature of political economic system, under which political economic elites inclined to exploit the crisis for their personal gain. Instead of as a problem, public health crisis has been seen as an opportunity to maximize the accumulation of power and wealth, which further deepens illiberalism in Indonesia. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Mughis. A great overview there of sort of the various different aspects of illiberalism that we've seen manifest in Indonesia's response to COVID. And while we're setting up for our third presenter on the panel, I'd just like to remind everyone taking part today that when we do get to the Q&A session, we'll be submitting the questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. There's no need to wait until after our third speaker has spoken to start submitting those questions. Please feel free to send them through now so that we can get promptly to them in the time we do have for discussion. But our third speaker today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bivitri Susanti, who is a lecturer at the Indonesian School of Law and chair of the Jakarta chapter of the Indonesian Association of Constitutional Law Lecturers. And Bivitri today will be speaking on declining rights and the rule of law in the pandemic in Indonesia. And so without further ado, over to you, Bivitri, to round out this panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave, and thank you for having me in this very important conference. Good morning, everybody in the Zoom conference room. I use my activist hat and academic perspective interchangeably here, trying to make sense about what's going on in the field, because especially after the passing of the job creation law yesterday, we have been hit, mentally quite seriously. So this is actually a good time to reflect on, again, to make sense on what's actually going on in the field. And I hope this will give nuance to the discussion later on, especially in terms of law and policy, after two very important political analyses by our colleagues previously. So my object of scrutiny, of course, is our laws, policies issued by the government during the pandemic. And I use rule of law as a framework, especially in looking at human rights and limiting potential abuse of power by the government. And I have been talking about this issue actually since probably back in March. Yeah, of course, again, using my activist hat and then trying to portray policies here and there. And so let me start by looking at policy responses on the pandemic from the very beginning. And as already mentioned before by the two speakers, the response in the beginning was very, and I will show you in terms of table. And then there's also a lack of evidence-based policy making, I would say. We discussed before about the fact that about the background of Tarawan as the Minister of Health, for example, and that adds up to the lack of evidence-based policy making in our government. And then there was even in the beginning, of course, this is not as simple as being confused about what legal basis to use, because there are also other interests. But let me show you the confusion, quote unquote, in the government about which one is the more appropriate to respond to the pandemic, and at the same time paying attention, of course, to the economy, because as Marcus already pointed out, there are already studies about the approach of the Jokowi government, especially in the past 5 or 6 years. So there is, as we know, in the Indonesian constitution, we have the state of provisions on the state of emergency and in the crisis situation. And then there are already a legal framework for that. A law on health quarantine of 2018, law on disaster management of 2007, and then a law on the outbreaks of infectious diseases, sorry for the typo, of 1984, and then old law on state of emergency in 1959. But then, excuse that my presentation here is in Bahasa Indonesia, the table, because I took it from the previous presentation. I just want to show you how slow the policy responses in the first 2 months. And then we can talk further, because there was also some criticism, of course, from the civil society and other stakeholders. But in the very beginning, it was, I would say, there's no response. There was no response, basically, because as we can see, although we already talked about the pandemic since December, only in March, actually in the end of March, that the government issued the first policy, if we can say it that way, on the pandemic, by finally implement the legal basis that is already there, that has been there to deal with the pandemic. And then in the end of March, literally in the end of March, the 31st of March, and then April, and then we already heard before, so I will not repeat how, on ad hoc basis, actually teams are established by the Jokowi government. Although we do have, of course, the Minister of Health, but then there's this team, that team, and then the pandemic and the economy team, and all that. And then there's also this discussion, especially by the middle class, I would say, about the lack of obedience, that people really don't like to wear masks and still have parties and all that. And then, of course, then they question about, the question is about the law enforcement. But we can also show that the lack of clear policy and political communication from the government also highlights the confusion of the people. So in the end, they would not believe in the government, in whatever policy they issued, and then there is this disobedience by many people on the health protocols. And then there's also this discussion about rights to health versus the economy, also have been pointed out by the previous speakers. But let me just highlight that there is this issue in terms of rule of law, that the rights to health has also been violated actually by the state by not issuing responsive policies or adequate healthcare for to deal with COVID-19. This is not new, of course, but now there is, and this will be this will come up also in the conclusion that I will make later on. This is not new, but now there is big attention on the facts about condition of public health policies and management. For example, about the hospital bed ratio to population. So many were quite shocked about that fact, for example. And then also the fact about the bad management of the universal health coverage system. Many hospitals complain that they haven't received any support from the government, or at least being late in getting the support from the government, even in terms of providing basic hazmat suits to work with the patients. And then there's also another issue on the rights to health versus rights to vote in regional election. We know that the regional election in more than 200 provinces and kabupaten kota will be held still in December 2020, although there are criticisms, there are protests about this, because there is a big number of cases coming out from this the process until now. And the argument is that the government cannot violate the rights to vote, as if there's only the rights to vote and we don't have the rights to healthcare in our constitution. And then most importantly, I believe, is the freedom of expression versus political stability. There are numbers. I can show you more probably later on if in the discussion, in the Q&A session. But there are many cases of digital attacks, in a number of conferences in some universities in Indonesia. I personally also got that kind of attacks. For example, every time we criticize the government, especially on the policy regarding the pandemic, there are other digital attacks like this. And of course, interestingly, this is the number that I can just show very briefly about press freedom just released very recently. But the discussion in terms of law, and this is I think the bad side of the legal discussion, especially among the activists, that the law enforcement agencies always say there's no direct link. You cannot prove that this is done by the government. But then the question is always that in the negara hukum, in the country based on the rule of law, then you have to deal with this. So although there's no direct link, but then the law enforcement agencies are responsible to deal with this issue. And then dui fungsi revival in the pandemic. Just quickly, basically, I will see. I noticed, Dave, that my time is almost up.
I think just 2 minutes to go.
Right. Thank you. So I mentioned dui fungsi revival because Marcus has pointed out about the involvement of the TNI in this pandemic situation, and his criticism is that it's not doing what it, the area that they can deal with. But adding up to that, I would say that there's also, they see this pandemic situation as the hole to break the wall, because there are also other policies, as if using the situation where we cannot participate in the policy making because of the pandemic. There are policies, for example, by involving BIN in this testing and all that, and then also in putting BIN directly under Jokowi in the new policy also issued during the pandemic, and other cases as well. Lastly is the rights to participate in policy making. The previous speakers already talked about this. But my reflection then, we can talk about that later on. Rule of law themes on freedom of expression, right to participate in policy making, political rights actually have been in question at least in the past 6 years. And if we talk about the fact that law in Minerba, the mineral and coal, and also yesterday just passed the law on job creation, they are very, very bad examples, yes. But we also have to admit that this actually happened also a year ago when there was big demonstration, and there was before the pandemic. So COVID-19 has made it more blatant. It's been there. But now, as if they are justified in the name of crisis management. Rule of law can be as if, can be put aside because we are facing crisis. And the pandemic is used as a whole to further break the wall of the rule of law. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I will give back the forum to Dave.
Thank you very much, Bivitri, for another really fascinating presentation highlighting some of the impacts that we've seen from the pandemic on a wide array of rights. And I'm sure in today's second session as well, we'll be hearing a lot further on some of those themes. Now, we do already have a couple of questions through in the Q&A, and I just mentioned to each of the speakers, as well as me relaying the questions, you're actually able to open the Q&A tab and have a sneak peek beforehand if you want to start formulating answers. The first of the questions comes from Adityani Putri, who asks, what is the explanation behind the president's insistence to keep Dr. Tarawan as health minister? Or put differently, Jokowi's inability to kick Tarawan out of the cabinet, despite his misgivings of the health ministry's performance. I think all of our speakers mentioned this in one way or another, so perhaps we'll give people an opportunity in the order that they spoke initially. So I might turn this over to you first up, Marcus.
If you look at why presidents and more particularly populists fire their health ministers during the pandemic, it's largely over a major disagreement in policy towards the pandemic, right? So Bolsonaro now went, I think, through at least 2 health ministers, and the first resigned because he was not, was kicked out of the cabinet because he was not in line with Bolsonaro's overall approach. We don't have that in Indonesia between Jokowi and Tarawan. Generally, Tarawan is doing exactly what Jokowi wants him to do, and that is in fact not pushing for lockdowns, not putting the health response over the economic considerations and so forth. So in terms of policy, there's very little reason for him to sack him. There's a personal aspect to this, of course, as well. We know that there is a close personal relationship between Jokowi and Tarawan. Tarawan was in charge of the cancer treatment for his mother. Tarawan is also very well linked in with a lot of the people that Jokowi surrounds himself with, Luhut and Hendro and all of these people who were prior to the pandemic patients of Tarawan. So he is protected by the inner circle, but most importantly, I think the only thing that Jokowi has mentioned that he dislikes about Tarawan's response is that he doesn't spend money quickly enough. But in terms of the overall approach to the pandemic, Tarawan isn't doing anything that the president wouldn't do either.
Thank you, Marcus. Mughis, did you want to jump in any further on that question?
Okay, I think I don't know the personal motive of Jokowi, does not kick Tarawan out of the cabinet, but what we can understand from the political situation at the moment is that it is, especially based on my standpoint, like that the government is actually has little interest in taking the pandemic seriously. So keeping Tarawan as health minister, although he does not perform well in responding to the pandemic, is part of the way broader regulatory network has no interest in taking the pandemic seriously, because when we can say that when the pandemic has been responded more seriously, it could be disturbs the interest to accumulate resources. As we can see, more the government or political business elite has more interest in exploiting the pandemic for their personal gain. So it is actually makes sense that Jokowi then keep Tarawan as health minister for doing nothing, because when health minister if the health minister does something good for responding to the pandemic, it will instead contradict to the interests of the predatory networks. So maybe that's my response.
Thank you. And Bivitri, is there anything you'd add to those comments?
Yes, please. Let me take this issue a little bit in the constitutional law analysis. Two responses. First, we have to see how constitutional framework provision is for ministries. That is the fact that Jokowi has to make the establish a cabinet. I'm sorry, I'm about my English. To create to establish a cabinet that that is suitable for political interest of the coalition. That's one fact that we cannot change as long as we still have the constitutional framework as we have now. So I would link that to Tarawan's background as in the military. There is, I think we have to pay attention more to that background. How Jokowi not only has to accommodate the political interest of the political parties, but also other stakeholders in Indonesia. And second response is that if the question is why he's still, Tarawan is still there, I would say that as long as, I disagree with this, but the fact is, as long as Jokowi can create ad hoc teams and putting his trusted aides, in the teams, this is not a good proper response in terms of constitutional law, but he has that room and he has been using that effectively. And this is actually not good precedent for further governance, because then the portfolio that is in the health ministry is not used, effectively. Instead, he will always use his trusted, ministers in ad hoc teams, probably furthermore in other issues. Thank you, Dave.
Yep. Thank you. And we might stay with you initially, Bivitri, for the second question we've got, which is from Kate Lamb from Reuters, who is flagging that this is potentially for quotation in a news story, asking what does the expedited passing of the controversial Omnibus bill into law this week say about Jokowi's governance amid the coronavirus pandemic?
Okay, let me continue on the keywords that I used before about his trusted aides. Yeah, so I would say that they are, of course, Marcus and Mas Mughis can explain it in the, political scientist analysis, that there are these trusted aides around Jokowi that actually own controls over the government. And I would say that the job creation bill, if we see the analysis, then we can agree with the analysis, but the problem is the way out. Many disagree, including myself. So what can we see from what happened yesterday is that the Jokowi government, actually this just highlights the fact that Jokowi government really into, as Eve Warburton also already wrote very, and also Marcus and other political scientists also already discussed previously about the developmentalism approach of the Jokowi's government. And in terms of, in the fields of law, this is again, I would say the revival of the law and development movement using law basically to serve the purposes of developmentalism. So first of all, Jokowi government then disregard the fact about the pandemic, because I understand that the economic analysis in the job creation bill actually was conducted more than a year ago. So the relevance to the current situation can be highly, questioned. And then secondly, that it also highlights the approach that Jokowi government, I would say, has been using in the last 4 or 5 years on the law and development. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks. Mughis, would you like to jump in also?
All right. I think since the beginning, the government, Jokowi, wanted to issue regulations to facilitate the investors. I mean, like very quick, in a very quick manner. And the pandemic, I think, is a very good chance to give a reason to hasten the passing of the controversial bill, as I mean, like Jokowi and his parties in parliament can have like rigid reasons to pass the bill, as it will be needed to answer or to address a problem in relation to the workers. Like many workers were laid off because of the pandemic, so Omnibus law can address that problems. So, and it should be noted here that the main thing of this law is actually to address a problem related to the labors, instead of what has been claimed by Jokowi since the beginning, to address issue related to like overlapping bureaucracy in in relation to investment, but the real problem is for the investment is actually how do they I mean, like how could they invest their money and hire workers, cheap workers, compared to so that Indonesia can compete with the Vietnam. That's the concern that in the beginning put by Jokowi in I mean, like issuing or drafting the Omnibus bill. So the pandemic is give very good reasons for the government and also for the parliament to pass this controversial bill by claiming that it is a good instrument, legal instrument, to address a problem resulted from the pandemic, where many workers have been laid off. I think that's my response.
Thank you, Mughis. Marcus, your thoughts on the Omnibus bill?
Yeah, I think yesterday's passing of the Omnibus bill fits into a broader pattern in which the Jokowi government has used the pandemic to push through controversial pieces of legislation and making use of the inability of NGOs, and in this case, workers' unions, to mobilize and protest against the legislation. So we had in May, and I think Bivitri mentioned that briefly in a presentation we had in May, the passing of the mining bill, which was equally controversial. But again, there was no mobilization against it because simply there wasn't any mobilization allowed at the time. The Omnibus bill actually long predates the pandemic, and Jokowi believes very strongly that in order to make Indonesia more attractive for investors, you need to reduce workers' costs and you need to reduce environmental protections. But that's, of course, precisely why that bill is so dangerous and why there should have been a broader discussion across society allowed. I followed the passing yesterday very closely, and I was concerned about a number of things. There was clearly the directive given to the leader of the House. So this was in charge of Aziz, the Deputy Speaker of the House, as a member of Golkar, to not even allow a vote on the bill, right? So this was pushed by the two parties that actually reject the bill, that is Partai Demokrat and PKS. They wanted to vote on this, so to register their concern towards it, and that wasn't allowed. And that's pretty unusual. There was clearly the willingness by the government, or the determination of the government, to get this passed quickly. It was also passed much more quickly than initially scheduled. Initially, we thought it would be passed on Thursday. It was rushed forward to Monday. So again, to avoid the possibility of mobilization. So there's a number of things in here that are deeply concerning, including also the prior promise of Jokowi to the workers' unions that the parts of the Omnibus bill that concerned workers' rights would be taken out of the Omnibus bill. That was an agreement reached prior to the 1st of May to prevent the workers' unions from demonstrating further. I think Jokowi has walked back that promise in the same way that he walked back the promise to the students that he would reconsider the KPK law, the law on the Anti-Corruption Commission back in September last year. So again, this fits into a broader pattern of rushing through legislation that is unpopular and that would have required much more consultation at a time in the pandemic that doesn't allow for such consultation.
Thank you, Marcus. Now, we are out of time, but there is one more question. So really looking only for one sentence answers from each panelist to this final question from Miftahul at Parayangan Catholic University, which is simply, what legacy will this pandemic leave for future politics in Indonesia? So looking for one sentence only, maybe from Mughis first, then Bivitri, then Marcus.
Yeah, as I said in my presentation, it will further deepens illiberalism in Indonesian democracy, I think.
Thank you. Bivitri?
I would say democratic regression due to the laws enacted during the pandemic, and also bad precedent in terms of governance, ad hoc teams and all that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And Marcus, to finish us off?
Yeah, so as I said previously, I think much of the democratic damage was done before the pandemic, and unsurprisingly, we see a continuation of that during the pandemic. I think if you look across the world, no country records improvement in democratic quality during the pandemic, and Indonesia will therefore be part of a broader pattern of democratic decline throughout the world as a result of the pandemic. But again, for me, the much more important issue is how democratic decline pushed Indonesia into responding in this way in the first place.
Thank you, Marcus. And we can't physically applaud the panelists for what I think has been a really fascinating first session. But if you could all join me in some form of virtual applause for our three panelists for a really fantastic start to our COVID conference. I think that's been really great. So thank you to you all, and back to you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Dave. Given the time, I think we'll go straight into our next session, our next panel of 3 speakers. And our chair for that session is Professor Vedi Hadis, the director of the Asia Institute and in charge of Indonesia International at the university. So Vedi.
Hi, thank you, Tim. So we'll just start off, I think, directly to the second panel of today's discussion on politics and rights. We have 3 speakers. As per the previous panel, each speaker will talk for 10 minutes and then there'll be 15 minutes for discussion. A couple of notes. Please do keep to your time. I'll try to remind you a couple of minutes beforehand if it seems like you might be going over your time. And for those who will put forward questions, it might be helpful if it were, useful for you to actually specify to whom your question is primarily directed at. Okay, so our first speaker, according to the program, is Dr. Inaya Rahmani, who teaches at the Department of Communication at the University of Indonesia and is the new director of the newly established Asia Research Center at the University of Indonesia. And Inaya will be speaking about COVID and academic freedoms in Indonesia. So Inaya, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Fadi, and thank you too to the organizers of this conference. I was briefed by the organizers to talk about academic freedom and COVID-19. I'm going to use this case to explain larger changes in Indonesian society, especially pertaining to media technologies whose use have been on the increase ever since the pandemic occurred due to shifting work at home. In that, I'm going to use Rodin's framework of participation and representation, especially because Rodin's thesis is at least useful for me to link between modes of participation of civil society and the ideologies of representation, which means that who and what is being excluded and included in public discourses means something for capitalist transformations. And I break down or link this with several main changes based on other people's works, especially Herlaman Wiratraman, who's been a consistent advocate for academic freedom and press freedom since Reformasi. Even before the pandemic, Herlambang has noted that there is an increase of disbanding of academic discussions on campuses and also civil society discussions. And the themes of these discussions have been communism, corporate pressures such as land grabbing, religious topics, including religious minorities such as the Ahmadiyya and LGBT issues, as well as other issues. Since the pandemic, there has been an increase of cyber attacks towards discussions pertaining to the Papuan identity, especially after Black Lives Matter. And after the pandemic, there has been also an increase on civil liberties, which includes not only academic freedom, but also press freedom, civic freedom, etc., who are gathering in virtual panels from various organizations to discuss on these issues. And they have experienced attacks, cyber attacks, which I will explain later on. And these issues also extend to any criticism towards the government's policymaking regarding COVID-19. This includes incoherent policy making on the national level, including the changes in the task force and appointing of retired army generals as the leaders of these task force, as well as criticism towards the main narrative of don't panic that has been resonated by the government since February 2020. At the same time, though, because people are moving into finding new kinds of works or tapping into their entrepreneurial self to survive income loss, the same space has also given new ways for former workers who lost their job, as well as homemakers, to sell products that they either produced independently or are reselling. And this opens up new avenues for marketization. And this is also a space that have already been populated by campaigners, advertising campaigners, political campaigners, as well as multinational and global corporates, digital companies monetizing on movements of people on social media. This is an illustration of the cases that were attacked during COVID-19, and it relates to hoaxes, it relates to criticism towards the government regarding COVID, it regards criticism towards capitalists, and the mechanisms are hacking WhatsApp, hacking Twitter, Instagram, phone terror, as well as Zoom bombing. So you can read this further if you're still interested in Herlambang's article. And what I want to show in this process is that the cyber attacks, Zoom bombing, and doxing, or publishing of private details to terrorize those critical of the government, actually gives way because people are carrying out these discussions on digital avenues for government repression without coercion. Because these attacks can be done by bots, by softwares, by anonymous account holders. It's technically very difficult to trace who is actually in charge and sending off instructions for the attacks. So there is increased, or at least intensified, impunity in terms of who's mobilizing or disbanding the discussions, because authorities or parties don't have to physically disband or send off a police officer or premans or vigilantes to disband a discussion, but this can be done systematically digitally. Am I running out of time?
No, you still have plenty of
3
time.
minutes, yeah.
No, you have actually 4 minutes.
And 2 seconds. The effects is that online trolling regulates the discourses that can be reproduced and talked about online. And this is linked with the kind of sentiment engineering carried out by political campaigners, who are also tapping into the kind of hoaxes and disinformation that spreads both virally and organically by ordinary people, and also imbued with sentiments that are mobilized and could be useful for the upcoming local elections. So the campaigners are reading out the sentiments and mood by expressed by voters regarding COVID to be studied and used for political campaigning that will be carried out almost fully online because of social distancing. And these involve professional and seasonal recruits. Professional meaning people who've transitioned from the advertising industry, whose skill is to carry out personal branding, political branding, with also seasonal recruits of precarious alumni, students, former students who have found it difficult to get a job. And meanwhile, during this process, there is the legalization of Omnibus law. There is also the law about Sisnas Iptek, the National System for Sciences and Technology, in which permits for foreign researchers are regulated and is subject to pidana, criminalization. And there's also economic recovery plan that is linked with both of these laws. So this is the kind of regulatory frameworks being that are useful or instrumental during times in which discourses about what can be talked about and not are occurring. So these are the administrative frameworks that Roden mentions in his book. And within this process, billionaires have wealth of some billionaires have soared, such as Bezos. Musk's has risen almost 200%, and Zuckerberg. So the kind of activities that are being contained by some parties, also some activities that are being magnified or being campaigned, those are monetized by digital capitalists that are centered in the United States. In the meantime, these discourses are contained and mobilized to my alarm is off, is being taken advantage of in the strengthening.
You have 2 minutes.
In the strengthening of local dynasties, because some individual candidates are going unchallenged, and they benefit from the types of campaigns that exist online, which means they don't have to campaign physically, which means lesser spending. And at the end here, I'm going to quote Thompson's review of Roden's book, which I thought was funny. He quoted on a football game because he was reading Roden's book during football season. And Lineker, who is a famous football player, said 22 men chase the ball for 90 minutes and at the end, the German always win. But it's not the case. The German didn't always win. And he posits that Roden makes a valuable contributions to the study of participation and representation. And while it may seem like a massive football match, competitions between elites, struggle over powers, and multiple narratives that can seem to go in different directions. But in fact, it is a number of players who compete for limited resource, and at the end, capitalist elites always win, whether it's globally, nationally, or in the formation or narrowing or the reorganization of elite on a local level. And media narratives and social media narratives are useful for us to understand this in terms of what kind of academic discourses can exist and which cannot. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Tom's point really was that every time Gary Lineker played for England against Germany, he always did lose. So that was the main point. So our next speaker is Wahyudi Jafar, who is a researcher in ELSAM, which is a human rights research and advocacy organization in Jakarta. I think set up sometime in the early 90s by an old friend and colleague of mine, the late Abdul Hakim Garuda Nusantara. Is Wahyudi here?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, all right. All right, so Wahyudi, you have 10 minutes, please. And you'll be speaking about public surveillance in the COVID environment, right?
Thank you, Professor Fedi, and good afternoon, everyone. Distinguished participant, I would like to express my gratitude to IDeHaRI and Silis for giving me this opportunity to participate in this discussion. I would like to explain the specific issue about the intrusion practices to the privacy during the handling of COVID-19 in Indonesia. First of all, what we see is the tendency of the using of technology instrument in handling COVID-19, which happen almost in all of the countries in the world. The use of the technology includes particularly on the use of the tracking application on the account of the conducting to the contact tracing, fencing, and tracking, mostly practices in ASEAN and the European countries, such as in South Korea, Singapore, Philippines, China, Taiwan, and also Indonesia. And the second, the use of the electronic fencings or pagar electronic to monitor the patient of the COVID-19 positive who have to stay quarantined or monitor their movement, as what happened in Taiwan. And the third, categorizing the population based on their color to determine whether they should be quarantined, be or not allowed to travel, as what China's government has done, a use of the apps. And the next, then what are the problems of the use of technology in handling COVID-19? There are at least 5 problems in the use of the technology in the handling of the COVID-19. The first, starting from the eagerness of the government to conduct surveillance for the sake of the handling the plague, the handling of the pandemic, including using of the mechanism which violate human rights. So the government uses the crisis as an excuse to conduct surveillance practices, use of the technology. And the second, due to the tendency, human rights violation, the public trust toward the technology was also low, which further affected to its effectiveness. And the third, the surveillance technology is easy to use in the crisis, but it will be hard to stop. There is no expiry date in the use of the surveillance technology, so that it will be institutionalized in the normal situation. Frankly speaking, In normal situations, the surveillance instrument will be used as a society controls instrument. The problems, for the fourth problems, related to the effectiveness and exclusivity of the technology use. A number of studies stated that mechanism of the contact tracing was only effective to be done in the early period of the virus spreading, providing that more than 60% of the population use of the tracing application refers to the Oxford study about the use of the contact tracing application. And the last of the problems, it is about the issue of the privacy and the personal data protection are the followings. In Indonesia, the main related to the protection of right to the privacy and the personal data protection is the fact that there is no comprehensive data protection law. Consequently, there is no legal and legal certainty of the personal data protection. Refers to the ELSAM study has found that 32 sectoral regulation related to the personal data protection, 6 of which related to the health sector, such as the medical practices law, health law, hospital law, and also the health manpower law. Specifically related to the handling of plague, the handling of pandemic, health quarantine law mentioned by Bibib regulates on the government's authority to conduct people surveillance or human surveillance during the pandemic. But there is no regulation on the procedure and the limitation about the surveillance, about the human surveillance, etc. Meanwhile, health data is part of the sensitive data with a high rise for the data subject. While Indonesia has not had a legislation which strongly regulates the rights of the data subject. And the next, not only is the legislation problems, not only in the level of the regulation problem, the threat of the privacy intrusion also arise if we see a number of policy options from the government in handling of the COVID-19 based on technology. Indonesian government stroke Ministry of Communication and Informatics has specifically launched the Peduli Lindungi or Protect and Care application aiming at the contact tracing based on the location or global position system, and also based on the Bluetooth technology. Other than that, Ministry of Health released electronic-based surveillance card in order to monitor the movement of the people who travel using the public transport, especially the airplane. Even the local government also launched similar application at the local level, obligate to be installed by the people who will travel, such as in Yogyakarta, South Tangerang, and other cities in Indonesia. In the context of the implementation of the large-scale social restriction or PSBB, a number of the shopping malls, especially in Jakarta, in the biggest city in Indonesia, obligates the visitors to give their certain personal data by scanning the QR code. Then recently, the Ministry of Health plans to issue an immunity passport for those having been infected by the COVID-19. And the policy option was worsened by the incident of the personal data leak of the COVID-19 patient, which also includes the patient health data. And up to now, it is still hanging unsolved because there is no regulation instrument to handling of the incident of the data breach. And to give the description about the use of the Peduli Lindungi application, especially, there are a number of problems related to the personal data protection in the use of the Peduli Lindungi application. Starting from that there is no privacy policy and adequate term of services for the use of the application, lack of adequacy in the adoption of the personal data principles in developing the application, such as the issue of the related to the principles of the purposive limitation, data minimization, storage limitation, and also the issue of the accountability in the use of the application. The application still takes several data which indirectly related to the COVID-19 handling. For example, the application compiling the data image and the memory card from the pawn cell. And other issue, it is about the data storage and the parties which can access the mine and processes data. Was it only be able to access by the Ministry of Health or another ministry and the institution? Time limit of the data storage, including the clarity of the data subject's rights to delete and the mine of the personal data. Other than that, the effectiveness problem of the contract tracing application, the users of the application compared by the total population, as what I have mentioned in the explained, the problem of the digital divide in Indonesia, especially between the West region and the Eastern region, and considering the unequal access of the technology infrastructure in Indonesia, and also the issue related to the false positive and the false negative in the use of
actually,
the
you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, the last, what will happen next? The recent technology development enables the surveillance practices which are not only conducted over the skin, but also under the skin. It can be so from the increasing number of someone's biometric data mining, including the health data, the process of which is accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The data mining will accelerate the development of biometric database technology, such as facial recognition or others for the purpose of the human life manipulation. The government also has the interest in conducting strict control to its society, use the panopticon approach, one of which is through the biometric data-based surveillance. We should remember that right to privacy as a pillar of the implementation of the civil liberties, including in Indonesia. Therefore, personal data protection law with a human-centric approach is required to guarantee human rights of the people. And currently, the House of Representatives, the DPR, and the President is in the process of the discussing of the personal data protection bill, and hopefully that the agreed material is aligned with the principles of the personal data protection and the guarantee of the protection of the right to privacy in the Indonesian Constitution, especially refers to the Article 20 FG paragraph 1 of the Undang-Undang Dasar 1945. Thank you, and it is my presentation, and apology for the long duration. Thank you.
So that's right. Thank you very much, Wahyudi. Our next speaker is Nadir Shah Hussain, who will be well known to many of you. He teaches law in Monash University, and dare I say, is an informal leader of the Believers here in Melbourne. So Nadir will be speaking about, quite appropriately, Islam, civil society, and the pandemic. You have 10 minutes, Nadir.
Terima kasih, Bang Fedi. Being the last speaker of today's program and without preparing for the PowerPoint slides, I can understand if some of you will fall asleep during my 10 minutes presentations, but I take my chance. Okay, so the COVID-19 pandemic has presented believers with a dilemma. Either they choose to lock down their prayers at home, or they view the pandemic as a challenge of their faith, and in response,
can I
refuse to maintain...
One second, Nadir?
Yes.
Could I just remind the attendees that they could submit their questions through the Q&A function there? Because it'd be good if we had some already available by the end of Nadir's presentation. Sorry for the interruption, Nadir.
It's okay. You need to give me 5 minutes extra then.
Oh.
Okay, so I repeat again. So the COVID-19 pandemic has presented believers with a dilemma. Either they choose to lock down their prayers at home, or they view the pandemic as a challenge to their faith, and in response, refuse to maintain a social distance from God and the public rituals that are part of their beliefs. The global pandemic has forced believers to contemplate a fundamental question: what is the purpose or benefit of ritual and worship? Is it something performed only to serve God, no matter the situation? Or is its purpose to make you and your loved ones happy and safe? Those who believe that ritual is intended primarily to serve God will put public worship ahead of concerns over COVID-19. They challenge other believers with difficult questions. Why you are afraid of the virus? You should be afraid of God. They oppose government regulation, forbidding them to organize mass prayers in mosques or other worship places. Those who take the second position believe God does not need our prayers. We are the ones who need God. There is room for interpretation and relaxation of some ritual requirements because worship is not solely for the benefit of God, but for us. Can we label these different opinions into a usual category of moderate versus fundamentalisms? I will offer my views at the end. These different opinions have led religious communities to respond in a variety of ways to the COVID-19 crisis. In mid-March, for example, thousands of Muslim pilgrims from across Asia gathered in Goa, South Sulawesi, to a 5-day ijtima, Islamic congregations. Organizers finally agreed to close the event after at least 8,500 people had gathered in the area. As a result, a cluster of infections arose in Goa. Hundreds of confirmed COVID-19 cases involved those who attended the Goa Ijtima. The administration of Central Java formed a team to track down approximately 1,500 residents who attended the mass religious gathering in Goa. The damage had been done. The three most prominent Islamic organizations in Indonesia, MUI, Majelis Ulama Indonesia, the Indonesian Council of Ulama, Nahdlatul Ulama, and Muhammadiyah, have all issued religious rulings or fatwas, ordering followers to some extent to avoid mass gatherings at mosques. However, many mosques are still holding regular Friday prayers as well as daily prayers. At the same time, it seems that the Jokowi administration was reluctant to impose strict prohibitions for people gathering at the places of worship during the pandemic. Prohibitions could trigger a political move by Islamist political parties. The situation seems to be getting worse when members of Jokowi's own administration issued different and conflicting statements or even confusing regulation, signaling to the already confused public a lack of coordination among key government officials. Jokowi administration seems to decide to make a balanced approach between health and economy. They propose the new normal in order to allow people to work and boost the economy. PSBB or large-scale social restrictions are being relaxed. At the same time, the mantra flatten the curve has not been reached. So it is not a new normal, actually, it is a new disaster. So back to the issue of praying at the mosque during daily and also Friday prayers, many Muslims, in fact, ignore the fatwas from MUI and Muhammadiyah on the grounds that why the government allows people to work in company and factory, but discourages us to go to the mosque. We are at the mosque only 30-60 minutes at the maximum, whereas those who come to the office or factory stay there for 8-10 hours. And also the market or pasar is still open, and they do not operate physical distancing. We pray at the mosque, practicing physical distancing 1 meter away from each other. That's their argument. As a result, some Muslims believe that government's policy in dealing with COVID-19 directed towards Muslim groups. They accuse that Jokowi's government is anti-Islam. Even worse, the COVID-19 pandemic is created by China or Jewish or US or Bill Gates or any other conspiracy theories behind that. Some of them simply did not believe that the COVID-19 is real. Taking advantage of this new normal, now people gather in every way, including at mosque, the fatwa allowing people to pray at home is no longer effective. It is business as usual. Only few mosques are still practicing physical distancing and health protocol. There is also what the media call pesantren cluster, the Islamic boarding school, the traditional Islamic boarding school. The government decided to assist pesantren and to allow their santri, their student, to return to their boarding school. We could not imagine that there will be strict rule on physical distancing and health protocol in pesantren. To those of you who are familiar and even got a chance to visit pesantren in the past, you know what I'm talking about. I myself repeatedly give a warning to both the government and pesantren that the health protocol that the government developed for factory or company or mall shopping during the new normal policy could not be applied in pesantren where the environment and the circumstances are different. The media reported that now we have around 50 pesantren that have COVID-19. It is sad stories that some prominent Gus and Kiai and also Bunyai passed away due to COVID-19 in recent times. On a positive note, we see that civil society get together and help people during the crisis. We see that many crowdfunding campaigns that have been launched on local platforms like kitabisa.com, for instance, to help those in need. This includes raising funds to support informal sector workers, such as street food sellers and motorcycle taxi drivers, and to buy personal protective equipment for healthcare workers. For instance, I myself helped raising fund around 186 juta rupiah using my social media campaigns as part of Jaringan Gus Durian and Gerakan Islam Cinta fundraising. In total, we managed to raise 6 miliar rupiah for these fundraisings. However, civil society, including NU, Muhammadiyah, Komnas HAM, Konferensi Wali Gereja, KWI, Persatuan Umat Buddha Indonesia, Permabudi, issue a statement strongly advising the government, the parliament, and electoral commission, KPU, to postpone the simultaneous 2020 regional head elections, Pilkada Serentak. But as we know, President Jokowi, through his spokesperson, Mas Fajrul, rejected the suggestion. And as a result, the government, the parliament, and the KPU decided to continue Pilkada Serentak. So they ignore public's voice. So you see, for the Islamic organizations, this is a double blow. First, that the Muslim community, Muslim followers ignore their fatwas, and now the government also ignore their advice. So I think I can imagine it is so difficult now for ulama to stand in this pandemic.
I'll give you an extra one because I interrupted you before.
Okay. As a conclusion, I think it is overly simplistic to label those who defy government and religious recommendation on physical distancing at places of worship as radicals or extremists. Likewise, it is unwise to label all believers who choose to worship at home as moderates. Different categories are needed, categories more suitable to use during the COVID-19 pandemic. I propose to use the category to capture one of the phenomena here, the rise of religious individualism versus religious institutions. The COVID-19 pandemic reveals that many individual Muslims no longer subscribe to the authority of religious institutions, such as NU, MUA, and Muhammadiyah. They are aware that their own afterlife depends on their own practice of religion. They are afraid that they could not get to the paradise if they ignore God during pandemic. They want to show that they are more afraid to God rather than to the Islamic organization or to the government. In the West, this sacral egoism could be seen as progressive one. But in the case of Indonesia, I'm afraid that the rising of this religious individualism is mostly based on anti-science, stubbornness, egoism, and ignorance. They become selfish, the egoistic attitudes in protecting faith, believing that the most important thing is to worship or to get into heaven, and that's all that matters. If other people get affected from their acts, well, that's their business with God. Thank you, Bang Fedi.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadir. I don't see any questions registered yet in the Q&A box. So maybe I'll just start the discussion, and by asking a question to everybody, and maybe
But I had a question too.
you have a question too. Oh, all right.
Yeah, you go first.
Put it in the box, mate. Yeah.
I
Okay.
can't. I'm technologically unable to.
All right. Okay. So I was just wondering. I mean, this is just a very general question. Listening to the previous panel and then this panel, it just occurred to me, that 6 years ago, when Jokowi was first elected, there was a great deal of excitement about the fellow as a reformer within Indonesian society and amongst the intelligentsia, and not least amongst many analysts here in Australia. But Inaya is talking about curtailment of academic freedom in universities. Wahyudi is talking about surveillance to the extent that the new order could not have been able to undertake because it didn't have the technologies. And Nadir Shah is talking about wholesale neglect of the views of the major, religious organizations in Indonesia that even the New Order consulted with when it made its decisions regarding Islam. So I guess my question is, what went wrong? What do you think went wrong? I mean, everybody had all of these ideas about Jokowi. What do you think went wrong? And why did it go wrong? Maybe we start just with Inaya.
As I was listening to the other presentations, and especially Mas Nadir's, I thought about the neoliberalization of the concept of God. So there is more direct accountability. There's also higher transactionalism. There's hyper competition. After all, the way humans construct an abstract notion about something that keeps them going, whether it's religion or ideologies or nationalism, chauvinistic patriotism, or whatever, it needs to fit within the neoliberal governance that all of us need to face every day. That's in terms of everyday life. In terms of regulation and the government, the elite need to work through the neoliberal government and governance in order to adapt and survive and respond to and take advantage of capitalist transformations, which is neoliberal transformation since the 80s and 90s. And this is in fact intensified after COVID because manufacturing sector is going on the decline, and there's an increase in the clouds, the monetization of whatever data is in the cloud, and that increases surveillance. So that's the economic movement that shifts and creates tectonic shifts in the way human beings relate to each other and their divine concepts that help them face everyday life. So that would be what I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wahyudi, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I think it is about the inner circle of the President Jokowi, who are the people's influencing the president in the handling of all of the situation and all of the powers, including the issue of the COVID-19. And the second, I think it is about the inner contestating in the political party support the President Jokowi. Jokowi conduct of the political negotiation to strengthening their power, use of the capacity. But they have the problem with the capacity are very simplistic in the handling the situation and conducting the political negotiation. I think it is in our perspective.
Okay, all right. Nadir,
Yes, Bang Freddy, I think this is the curse of second term for Jokowi. This also happened, this curse, with President SBY in his second term. So worse, I think Jokowi is the most weakest president in the reform era, even weaker than Gus Dur, because Jokowi, he did not have his own political parties. So when he said that in his second term, he doesn't have any burden, well, actually, that's not right, because he doesn't have any burden and he doesn't have any power at all. So then I think we see that in his term, he could not pick the right man for his minister, and also now he tried to build his own dynasty, a political dynasty, as a compensation of having no power at all in his own political parties. So I think the second term reveal who the true Jokowi is, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for those insights. Tim, what was your question? Is it directed to everybody?
Yes. Thank you very much, Freddy. My question is very similar to the last one. But it's a little more focused on one particular aspect, which is civil society. Civil society was seen as a hallmark of the post-Suharto period. Much of Reformasi, before it all petered out, was driven or engineered or facilitated by civil society. But this, the sort of democratic regression, if you like, the liberal term, whatever you want to call it, that's been accelerated by the pandemic, is largely directed against civil society through surveillance of academics, but also surveillance in a broad sense, curtailing of freedoms and so forth. The aim is to stop criticism of government, much of which comes through civil society, whether religious or non-religious in nature. So my question really is, if that's the case and all these things are accelerating, these trends against civil society or that restrict civil society are accelerating because of the pandemic, what's the prognosis for civil society post-pandemic? And would Indonesia, with a weakened civil society sector, which looks likely, be a very different place?
Okay, I think we'll go the other way around now, and we'll get Nadir to start off with the answers.
Yes, I can only talk civil society in the context of what the Kiai or pesantren thinks about this issue, Tim. I think what they said is that now they want to go back to pesantren. They want to maintain the main point is to educate santri. I think they learn a hard lesson from Pilpres when they tried to support Jokowi, even to allow Kiai Ma'ruf as a vice president, but at the end they lost the Minister of Religious Affairs positions. So they said that, well, now maybe it's better for us not to think about the politics for the moment. We just want to go back to our core roles to educate a santri at the pesantren. I think that's what they wanted to do.
Okay, all right. And so Wahyudi?
Yeah, I think we have the issue about the civil society in the engage with the Jokowi's government. The first issue, it is about the confusing situation or the difficult situation after the several of the prominent figure of the JSOs, joined with the Jokowi's bureaucracy in the KSP, for example, or another ministry. It is the confusing about the map of the civil society in the process of the engagement with the Jokowi's government. And the second, the JSOs, very shocked while the Jokowis appointed the Prabowos as one of the minister, as the Ministry of Defense. So mostly of the human rights civil society organization, especially, and the another civil societies come back against the Jokowi's governments, because there is no the consistency between the Jokowi's political promise about the the settlement of the past human rights violation, etc., and also the integrating of the human rights consideration in their development plan, etc. So I think in the second period of the bureaucracy, mostly of the civil society organization take the strong positions to criticizing and against the Jokowi's bureaucracy. I think it's for me.
Okay. Well, while we have you here, Wahyudi, there is one question that's directed at you specifically, so you might as well answer it now. So the question is, how can we refer to WHO principles on data surveillance practices when the legal framework for data protection in Indonesia is actually very weak? So can we use those principles from the WHO, and how can we do that when our own legal framework?
Basically, all of the sectoral legislation related to the data protection in Indonesia mostly not follow the principles of the data protection, with the difference of the purposes of the data compiling or data processing, with the differences of the principles of the data processing, etc. So we difficult to adopt of all of the international best practices developed by the WHO, including developed by the UCLA, the American Civil Liberties Organization. They also developed of the several principles during the contact tracing in the pandemic, and also the several countries in the Europe refers to the EU General Data Protection Regulation. They are also developed of the several principles in the conducting of the contact tracing during the pandemic. But in Indonesia, we thought the comprehensive data protection law and regulation, so we difficult to develop of the principles of the gathering of the personal data, including the processing of personal data. But we hope after the process of the legislation in the House in this year, Indonesia will pass of the new and the comprehensive data protection law, and with the 2 years period of transition, so we can adopt all of the principles of the data processing, including all of the legal ground of the data processing. So all of the sectoral legislation related to the data privacy in Indonesia will follow the new of the legislation on the personal data protection.
Right. Okay, thank you. Inaya, do you want to follow up on that question about civil society?
I would think that it's somewhat a continuation of the fragmentation of civil societies after Reformasi, because democratization have introduced and decentralization have introduced the breaking up of ideologies and agendas, political agendas that civil society movements are latching onto. And this also links with the neoliberalization of the donor agenda. You have empowerment programs on the village level, you have gender equality, you have religious mainstreaming, religious freedom, and this creates small pockets for activists. And at the same time, upward mobility for local activists to enter the national arena and global arena. So it comprises of more intertwining with global economy. And I think without fundamental discussion about what civil society is, whether it's about civic liberties or it's about socioeconomic struggles, this agenda needs to be commonly held by different sections of activist groups, because as it is, rather than direct these idealisms or struggles towards the elite, I'm finding that this generation is breaking up in their movements for personal and moral positions regarding to what's more important to be fought for. So I think there needs to be a common agenda agreed by different sections in civil society, including academic and activists.
So the old problem of fragmentation of civil society. Yeah. We have one other question here, which could probably serve as an appropriate way to end this particular session. If each of you could just answer this for maybe 1.5 minutes each. The question is, again, a fairly straightforward one. Now, all of you have painted a fairly bleak picture. I don't know why. Is there anything good at all, any positive at all that can be observed from Indonesia during the pandemic? Which is a good question. Maybe start again with Inaya, and just so that I don't get confused, we'll just go through what's on my list in the sequence that I have it, because otherwise I'll get confused.
I've somewhat answered Max's question, but I'm opening up for another bleak picture. I'm finding that on an everyday level, the kelurahan, sub-district level, neighborhood level, there are social relationships that that while there is some class antagonism, but at the same time it gives spaces for the use of mosques or the use of community spaces for the bagi-bagi sembako, for the distributing of staples that are being collected by higher classes in the neighborhood. This capacity is a state capacity or community capacity that is less apparent in governance, but on an everyday level, you see that cutting of, distribution channels, lebih pendek jalur distribusi, shortening the distribution channel of products and food, because healthier food, cleaner food must come from people that we know. So there are these spaces that are also enabled by digital markets. But at the same time, when this occurs, when this is become a practice, then it takes away the responsibility from the government, because it should be the government that organizes these distributions and to make sure that no one is without income. And second, it masks the fact that the labor market is increasingly more precarious, because now we have homemakers also able to sell their cookings, which is, I'm one of them. So it opens up another bleak picture, although while doing it, it seems nice because there is some social bonding.
Okay, all right, thank you. Wahyudi, what's been nice about the pandemic?
Yeah, I think similar with Mbak Inaya, it is about the empowerment in the civil society level to help others use of their resources. And the second, I think after the pandemic, the civil society in Indonesia have the clear positions in the negotiating and the engagement with the government. And the third, I think we can optimizing of the use of the digital technology, and currently mostly of the civil society in Indonesia actively participate use of the digital technology, and we can optimizing all of the instrument and developing it's in the defense and also criticizing and also enabling the environment in the political participation after the pandemic. I think it is from me.
Okay, thank you. Nadir?
I only add one small thing, Bang Fedi. From my perspective on the Islamic studies, now more and more pengajian conducted online. So I think the good thing is now even traditional kiai now deliver their sermons online using online platform. So I think they realize now that what they pray is they pray to the high-tech God. I think that's what the good thing, I think.
Okay, all right. So we had actually one more. Do we have 2 or 3 more minutes, Tim?
We've got one more question you can do, I think.
Okay, well, maybe it's just one question that maybe I'll just ask one of you to answer. It's not here anymore, but I saw it. So the question was, people usually have talked about the COVID situation as exposing social inequalities in society. Can any one of you say something about that in relation to Indonesia? Something quick, please. Who would volunteer? Social inequalities and the pandemic. Anybody? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. We got Inaya.
Highlighted and intensified. I would take the case of working from home. Shifting work into the digital spaces means that the laborer, the worker, comes from the service industry. And workers who are part of the manufacturing industry, those who need their physical movements, are largely excluded in work from home. That's the first. The second is working from home also reveals some class elements, such as how to divide laboring, domestic laboring in the household. So you have patriarchic elements and gender elements in domestic and domestic spaces that are mainstreamed into public spaces because of these Zoom meetings. What else? 1, 2, 3, that's social inequalities. That's all I can think of. The aged, actually, I have a personal experience. Can I answer with a personal experience?
Yeah, all right, yeah.
There is 10 seconds? Okay.
30 seconds.
The ageism actually also is an issue because choices of management of who to let go in the transition to work from home means that they would let go of those who are not digital natives. And in some situations, there is some assistance that is concentrated on the younger generations to assist their older counterparts in using digital technology. So it's mutually exclusive, actually, mutually excluding from the spaces that benefit mainly the job owners or employers or capitalists. So it may seem like a disarray or a web of different social elements to inequality, but this actually is rooted in the precarious labor market that's shifted into digital spaces for those who are either privileged enough or unfortunate enough, because it opens up this Pandora box of domestic and public responsibilities at home, which exacerbates patriarchic divisions in some cases, especially in religious households that are orthodox or dogmatic. So that would be my a bit of a messy response.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, time is up. So I'll thank you for all the speakers. Thank you for all the questions. Shall we congratulate the panelists in the unusual...
Thank you, Bang Fedi.
Okay, and so I'll hand it over back to Tim.
Thank you very much, Fedi, and thank you to all three speakers for really interesting presentations. And thank you, in fact, for all our presenters today. I've been getting quite a bit of feedback on the email from people who have found it very interesting and stimulating. For those who joined us today, I hope you will all join us again tomorrow for our second session. Tomorrow, we're looking at the issues that were covered in that last question. We're looking at marginal disadvantaged members of society. Our first panel will look specifically at the health issues. We'll have Iwan Aryawan, Pandu Riono and Tri Maharani looking at health specific questions. And our second session will have Ian Wilson, Andi Yentriani and Chuchu Saida looking at marginalised groups and their experience of the pandemic. So health and marginalised groups are the key themes. Tomorrow with our chairs, Associate Professor Linda Bennett and Dr. Ken Setiawan. I hope everybody, including our panelists today, will be able to join us again tomorrow. That's all, folks. Thank you so much. And a round of applause to everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Pak Tim.
Thank you.
Bye.